is perfect. And so I want to greet those of you who are watching us online on YouTube. So Happy New Year to everyone. Thank you also for Brianna for making our bulletin on time every Sabbath. Brianna Ramos, thank you very much. Today we're going to have our communion service after this short sermon. And as we reflect on the communion service, the death of Jesus Christ, the celebration of his death, and looking forward for his return, I remember when I was growing up in the Adventist church where I never knew the significance of the communion service until I began reading the Bible seriously and closely. And I discovered that eating or table fellowship in the Old Testament sheds light to the institution that Jesus established in the New Testament as a memorial of his death until he comes. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 26, it says, "For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes." So you see, that's the importance of this ritual that we are going to participating in today. It reminds us, it memorializes the death of Jesus death until he comes. And so you might ask the question, why did Jesus use this imagery of sharing a meal or the concept of eating for establishing the institution of the communion service? Well, looking at it in the light of the cultural significance of sharing a meal in the ancient Near East and in the Bible would answer such question. There are passages in the Bible that give us a hint of the deeper meaning of sharing a meal. Remember the story of Isaac. Isaac settled down and pitched his tents at Beersheba. And something happened there and so on. And Abimelech, king of Shechem, came to him and made a peace treaty with him because there was a little quarrel, a little conflict. But King Abimelech of Shechem came to him and made a treaty. And it's interesting that if you're going to read Genesis chapter 26, verses 28 to 31, they mark this peace treaty with a feast of eating and drinking. Isn't it interesting? Likewise, after making a covenant and mending their differences, Laban and Jacob sealed their covenant like a peace treaty again with a meal. If you're going to read Genesis chapter 31. In Genesis 31, verse 44, Laban said to Jacob, "Now therefore," Genesis 31:44, "Now therefore come, let us make a covenant, you and I, and let it be a witness between you and me." So they're trying to make a covenant with each other. And then in verse 46, it reveals that Jacob asked his brethren to take stones and make a heap of stones. And it says there in verse 46, "And they ate there on the heap of stones." You see, there was eating that happened. So, in other words, in the ancient world, eating at the same table with someone meant establishing a strong bond with that person. To share a fellowship with a person in ancient time meant one's readiness to make a covenant with that person or a pledge of such complete loyalty as to become one with that person. So that's how significant eating, sharing a meal with someone was. Even today, dating is usually done with eating, right? Having dinner. You date someone, you want to know someone, you should have dinner. You should eat together. Business transactions are always accompanied with having a meal together. So you cannot avoid eating. Eating is very significant. And that is probably one of the reasons Daniel and the 3 Hebrew young men did not eat the food from the king's table when it was offered to them. Of course, aside from they were unclean food, but Daniel chapter 1 verse 8 tells us that Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. Aside from being unclean food, there must be a reason behind of not partaking the king's table. And commenting on this particular text in Daniel, an author notes, by Eastern standards, to share a meal was to commit oneself to friendship. It was of covenant significance. Then the commentator continues, those who had thus committed themselves to the allegiance accepted an obligation of loyalty to the king. It would seem that Daniel rejected this symbol of dependence on the king because he wished to be free to fulfill his primary obligations to the God he served. Another author shares similar views when she declares, the food and wine are, in other words, the symbol of political patronage, and to consume them would be tantamount to declaring complete political allegiance. In other words, sharing a meal not only means making a covenant with someone, but it also means trust, brotherhood, and forgiveness. Remember the parable of the prodigal son? The father ordered a feast and celebration. In Luke chapter 15, verses 23 and 24, the father says, and bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead, and is alive again. He was lost, and is found. And they began to celebrate. We know that this celebration was accompanied with eating. There was eating. When I visited Jordan, first time, I firsthand witnessed the communal meal being done in Jordan called Mansaf, M-A-N-S-A-F, Mansaf. You know, the Mansaf is a delicate mixture of rice, lamb, and pine nuts served in a big plate where partakers participated by helping one another to finish it. It's a big plate. And they eat using their right hand, making a ball out of rice and lamb in order to put it into their mouth. That's how you eat mansaf. And it is a taboo to use the left hand for any Middle Eastern meal. You have to use your right hand. And so you can see here a big plate of mansaf, rice, lamb, and pine nuts. And everyone would circle around this big plate, taking their part, eating together, making a bowl of rice and lamb and pine nuts, and put it in their mouths with their right hand. No utensils, just bare hands. That's how they eat. And so they help one another, if it is needed, to break a large piece of meat, for example. You need someone, you don't need to use your left hand because it's taboo to use your left hand. You just use your right hand. And if you want to break something like a lamb, you have to ask your companion, someone beside you, to break the lamb, to break the meat for you. And so it is a joy to see such kind of communal meal where everyone needs one another to accomplish the task of eating the mansaf. And so while watching the mansef kind of meal, it brings to mind the idea of community and mutual dependence. That as we eat together, there is a sense of community and there is also dependence of one another. You cannot just eat alone. You need someone to help you. And I believe that this is the same principle that God wants us to have whenever we participate in the communion service in the church. Of course, we are not going to eat in a big plate of mansef. We will be given an individual unleavened bread. But such meaning from the biblical background gives us important implications for our communion service today. The idea of community and mutual dependence with one another, the notion of establishing relationships and mending one, are the appropriate attitude we can have during the communion service. And we cannot only apply such meaning of eating to human relationships, but also to our relationship with God. We are showing loyalty. We are showing our renewing relationship or renewing our commitment to God every time we join the communion service. And so the invitation of Jesus to share a meal with him in the last book of the Bible, in the book of Revelation, attests to the deeper meaning of communion service we have discussed. In Revelation chapter 3, verse 20, declares, "Here I am. I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with him." In some other versions, I will come in and dine with him, and he with me. Isn't it an interesting picture of Jesus eating, dining with us? Indeed, being aware of the ancient Near Eastern cultural significance of eating and drinking and sharing a meal, and what the Bible tells us about the meaning and the significance of sharing a meal, will make our participation in the communion service today more meaningful and relevant. And so now we will divide ourselves. We will do the rite of humility, the foot washing, and the couples, the husband and wife, will do the foot washing in the fellowship hall, in the main hall, while the single ladies and single men will do their foot washing in the different Sabbath school rooms, and the deacons and the deaconess will help you, single men and single ladies, where to do the foot washing. So let's divide ourselves now and do the rite of humility in preparation for the distribution of emblem. May God bless you as you do the rite of humility.